It's lights out, everybody, and welcome back to the Low Downforce podcast, the forefront Formula One podcast. You have Josh, you have Matt, you have J9, and you have myself, Ben. And we are back with another F101 episode. If you are unaware, this is our second season doing a Formula One podcast. We've been fans for a tiny bit longer than that, but not too much longer. But you might be a brand new fan to Formula One. This might be your first season checking us out. And we want to make it as easy as possible for you to get into the sport, get as Formula One addicted as we are. But there's a lot of facets in the sport, so we're trying to break it down into a little bit of an introductory course, a series of episodes we're calling F101, to give you some high-level descriptions of all the different things happening in Formula One. We've already had a couple episodes out, so I highly recommend you check those out. But today we are talking about sprint races. We have our first sprint race of the season coming up, and you might think they're already racing. What's a sprint race? What does that mean? Well, that's exactly why we're here, and tell you how a sprint race is a little different than the Grand Prix we know and love.
Yeah, sprint races are fun. They were introduced by Formula One just a few years ago to try and make the weekend more enticing. Everyone doesn't really watch practice. Like, who cares, you know?
Practice? We're talking about practice?
So F1 said, let's get rid of most of the practice and add in more racing. So in a sprint weekend, they do exactly that. They have a single practice session followed by sprint qualifying, also known as the sprint shootout, which is on Friday. Then Saturday, they have the sprint race followed by Grand Prix qualifying. So the regular qualifying for the Grand Prix. And then Sunday, you have the full-length race. So in the normal weekend where they have 3 practice sessions, here they just have 1. And it makes it more enticing because the teams don't have as much time to set their cars up the way they like and tinker with it and all that because there's only one practice session. So it really throws a wrench in the whole weekend. And the sprint race, you get points. So it really puts more on the line earlier in the weekend, throughout the weekend. P1 through 8 get points in descending order. You get 8 points for P1, 1 point for P8. And sprint has nothing to do with the Grand Prix qualifying. So there's still its own qualifying for the Grand Prix. The sprint is its own thing that just replaces some practice. So it's fun. It changes it up. The drivers are kind of like hit or miss on whether or not they like it. I think the fans overall like it because there's more racing. But, you know, everyone makes their own opinion. So once you watch the race, you can make your own opinion if you like it.
Yeah. And I think when I first heard about a sprint, I thought it was just you're doing 1 lap and that's it. But it is a little bit different. It's a lot shorter. But when you're doing the qualifying, aka sprint shootout, it's very similar to regular qualifying, but slightly different. So you still have that 3 qualifying round setup. So SQ1, SQ2, SQ3 is we'll refer to it as. But your SQ1, that first one, is a 12-minute round. The SQ2 is a 10-minute round, and then SQ3 is an 8-minute round. So again, very similar, but shorter timing. And what's different about this one is that they're mandatory tires. So we talked in another F101 series about qualifying and using your tires as a strategy and using different ones depending on what you're trying to do. Here, you can't use that same strategy because it is required to use specific tires. So in your SQ1 and your SQ2, you're required to do your medium tires. And then in SQ3, again, that's the last one. That's when you're trying to set yourself up to get that pole position, the highest you can be. And that's when the drivers are going to go the fastest. That's when you are required to do your soft tires. Again, those soft tires are going to get you the maximum amount of speed, assuming there's no rain. So the shorter sessions and the mandatory tires are the biggest key differences between the regular qualifying for the race and the sprint shootout, the qualifying for the sprints.
And the sprints themselves are a little different. We've talked about they've got points like the Grand Prix. They got to do laps like the Grand Prix. But there's a few things that make sprints stand out. So a normal Grand Prix, is however many laps it takes to complete 300 kilometers driving. So different tracks are different lengths. It takes different number of laps, but they're all about that same distance. Sprint races are a third of that. It is a 100-kilometer race, and therefore it's about a third the number of laps as you get in a Grand Prix. As Josh mentioned, and as Matt will get to in a minute, instead of the top 10 scoring points, the top 8 score points. But still, there's a meaningful amount of points at stake that drivers are and teams are very interested. But the other thing that really sets sprint races apart from Grand Prix is, and we will talk about this in our next F101 episode when we go more into tires, is in a Grand Prix, you have to use two compounds of dry tires in a race, which requires you to make a pit stop to change said tires. In a sprint race, because of the shorter distance, a pit stop is not required. So the sprint shootout is very important because you're not going to make up any ground in the pits. It is start to finish, you are going. Now, that's not to say you can't use a pit stop. We've seen sprint races where teams have gone for the soft tires and some teams have gone for the medium tires. One will last, the other is quicker, but they have to pit stop. Otherwise, those tires will be destroyed before the end of the race. So pit stops can happen, but they aren't required where they are required in the Grand Prix. If that's still confusing, our next episode I mentioned is tires and pit stops. So a 2-for-1 special, very relevant to what I am talking about right now. So if you're interested in this, if you're still confused, be sure to check that out. But before we get there, the last important rule is that penalties in sprint races are applied to qualifying and or the Grand Prix. So Josh talked about the chronology of practice, sprint shootout, sprint, qualifying, Grand Prix. So if you pick up a penalty for booping somebody in the butt on the track, for causing a crash, for driving unsafely, you can either take a grid drop during the race or other types of penalties that will affect you in the actual Grand Prix. So you got to be careful. You have less time to get your car right, but you got to drive smart, because also if you absolutely obliterate your car, we've seen instances where teams have not been able to repair that car in time for qualifying later that day. So there is very much a lot at stake.
Yeah, and speaking of stakes, there are, like we talked about, there's a point system. Josh mentioned, P1 gets 8 points, P8 gets 1 point. And it's a lot simpler for the sprints, honestly, than, go back and listen to our F101, the basics episode. I talked about our regular Grand Prix scoring system. It just goes down. So 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it's pretty simple. There are 6 sprint races this year, which means that there's a total of, I guess it's 36 points per sprint, so 216 sprint points. And one thing I didn't mention in our basics episode is that there are 101 points per race available during the regular Grand Prix. So all in all, maybe we're not all math guys, it's totally fine. But at the end of the day, sprints account for about 8% of the total number of points that are in the season. So it's not to say that it's not important. By all means, these are what can make or break a championship. But again, there's like 2,640 total points available across the season, and 216 of those are sprints. And again, this could be a huge deal if we had this sprint format back in 2021, the Verstappen versus Hamilton race. The battle there could have been a lot closer and decided earlier in the season. So
if you don't know what we're talking about at the end of 2021, just Google Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Abu Dhabi 2021, and the entire internet will start screaming at you. Because there was a lot of controversy. But like Matt said, points are very important in the sprint races. There are enough points in the sprint races alone that could have determined the Constructors' Championships last year, could influence driver championships entirely. So Formula One introduced them to add more excitement to the fans, add more reasons to tune in on a Friday, on a Saturday, but also create more stakes, have more season lasting effects from these races. And that's exactly what we get. As we mentioned, this episode is coming out just before the first sprint race of the season. So be sure to tune in, not just on Sunday this weekend, but also Saturday. Tune in if you can. Grand Prix are capped at 2 hours long, and these are a third of the length. So this is a 45-minute bish bash bosh in and out. So even if you have less than an hour, you can definitely sneak a sprint race in. I know I do. So we've talked a lot about this. We've talked a lot about F101 and new topics in other episodes. If anything is confusing to you in this episode, if you want to learn more about something that we didn't talk about, please let us know in the comments on YouTube or on all other social medias at Low Downforce Pod. We will gladly make another episode. If we have to explain something more, we will gladly respond to your comments to give you a quick answer to a question if that's all it takes. But check out our existing F101 episodes. Tune in to the F101 episodes that are still yet to come. We're no experts, but we've started to build up a little bit of knowledge about the sport. We do love it very much. So be sure to tune in, and thank you for tuning in thus far. We will talk to you soon. Until then, stay speedy. Goodbye.